Everything's going well. And actually, Krystal, what we're going to talk about is some of the things that are going on in the Republican world right now. Let's pivot to B1. We can put B1 up on the screen because votes are still being counted. And Dave Wasserman noted on X yesterday, he said, new Cook Political, over 154 million votes now counted. Trump's popular vote lead is down to 1.65%. Trump is, of course, claiming that his popular vote margin is a mandate, and his electoral college margin combined is a mandate for him and his administration as they prepare to come into office in January, Krystal. And, listen, he won. Most people didn't expect him to win. Many people didn't expect him to win. He still has a popular vote margin. He was successful in the battleground states. I do think, as much as the left was wrong about this election, that the right finds itself in a very precarious position as well, because almost 50% of the country voted for Kamala Harris, who was a terrible, truly terrible candidate. I think Alan Lichtman, not entirely wrong that some giant chunk of the country would have voted for Joe Biden because they are so either they're so genuinely afraid of Donald Trump or they hate Donald Trump so much. This is not like the vibe shift I think a lot of people are now seeing it as. It's significant. There's no doubt about it. I don't think Donald Trump is wrong at all to be taking a victory lap. I do think Republicans should realize that it isn't as though the country has suddenly embraced Donald Trump warmly and brought him in and said, we love you, Grandpa. Like, please guide us to a better future.
Well, and in some ways, the trouble is even more clear down ballot, because in most of the swing state Senate races, they lost. I mean, they were able to very narrowly pick up Pennsylvania. And then obviously they won Montana, where actually John Tester outperformed more than almost any other Democrat. I think he outperformed Kamala by 13 points, but in Montana, that's not enough. They picked up West Virginia, another obvious one. But when you're talking about, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, they weren't able to pull it off. And so, Trump seems to be a bit of a unique figure. You had huge numbers of voters who voted only for Trump and then just left the rest of the ballot blank, which was a phenomenon that Democrats saw with Obama, which ended up being a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for their own party's problems, because Obama famously, while he was very good at getting himself reelected, he was very poor at expanding the Democratic Party. In fact, the Democratic Party was really destroyed in rural areas under the Obama administration. They end up, losing the House, losing the Senate, and then ultimately handing the presidency over to Donald Trump. So that was a warning sign for them that, okay, you've got this one figure that can really drive up turnout, and people, give him this sort of unique and special status that doesn't necessarily translate to the rest of the party. So the other thing that I think, Emily, is that while Trump was saying a lot of, the more extreme, in my view, things that he's going to do in the administration, that the RNC, they're holding up signs that say mass deportation now, and certainly, characters like Matt Gaetz and RFK Jr. and whatever, no one would be surprised that they're in this orbit, et cetera. I also think, and Trump said things like, I will be your retribution. I'm going to suspend the Constitution. I'll be a dictator on day one. So it's not like he wasn't saying these things. But I know among a lot of Wall Street people, I think among a lot of people in general, they felt like, well, it's just Trump. And he doesn't really mean these things because, we saw him in action before and he didn't do the craziest things that he claimed he was going to do. So they were able to, the fact that he's really dishonest and just makes a lot of stuff up all the time ended up being a benefit, because they could pick and choose which parts of what he was saying they liked, and the parts that they didn't like, because he's not serious about that piece. Yeah. And now, at least in the early phases of the administration, it is very much my sense that he was serious about all the things that he was saying, including, we're going to talk about Elon and Vivek. I know it's been sort of floated that this is a make work project that they're put on, but to massively slash government spending and social safety net programs and all of these things. I don't think that's really true, because the administration also appears to be looking at what powers they have to unilaterally make these sorts of cuts without Congress. So I think they're serious about that. Our friend Jeff Stein has done a lot of reporting on that. We had him on earlier this week to talk about, they're also looking at how they can use existing code and doesn't require Congress to implement a massive increase in tariffs potentially across the board. So I think he's serious about that too. And, that's very likely to lead to inflation, a lot of economic chaos in terms of the markets and all those sorts of things. So I think, those things should be taken seriously. And we've certainly seen with the personnel choices with regard to immigration that, the mass deportation plans, Trump reiterating that he wants to use the military and declare a national emergency to engage in mass deportation. Like, I think that was true as well. So the Trump people seem to have this feeling that and this mandate for a truly revolutionary type government.
Like Reagan in 84.
And I think there's some part of the populace that voted for that and wants to see that. And I think there's some part that was just prices were lower and there were fewer wars under the Trump administration. I'd like to get back to that, and didn't actually sign up for Matt Gaetz and all of the whole program that is now being put into place.
Or they were willing to risk that in order to prevent Kamala Harris from becoming president, which is interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean they support it, though. It means that they might vote it out 4 years later or in the midterms. So, yeah, I mean, I think the election was really close. The popular vote continues to get smaller and smaller. I think it's very significant that Donald Trump won the popular vote, especially after all of the lawfare. I think it's very significant that he won the popular vote after January 6th. All of these things do absolutely count. It's not, I think there is a vibe shift afoot. There is a cultural shift afoot. I don't think that this is obviously, mathematically, plainly, this is not a Ronald Reagan 1984 type of mandate. And if you look at Florida in particular, Florida had two very interesting amendments that voters were deciding. Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. They had to get to the 60% threshold in order to pass. So this is weed and abortion, enshrining these into the constitution of the state, and recreational weed. And what's really interesting about this is most of the headlines have been, okay, these amendments failed. Well, they failed barely. So in a state where you had these pretty dramatic shifts among different demographics towards Trump wins handily, Republicans are doing great, Rick Scott wins, all of that happens. You also almost have voters. I mean, it was really, really close on abortion, enshrining it into the Constitution.
It was 58% or something like that.
Yeah, it was exactly. And the same thing with weed. And I think I posted this a couple of weeks ago. I said Kamala Harris, a terrible candidate, won 47% of the popular vote. Most Americans support abortion access, gay marriage, legal immigration, tax hikes on corporations and the rich, a robust social safety net, et cetera. Trump understood that better than most of the Republican Party and neutralized some of the vulnerabilities, but those vulnerabilities are still there, and Democrats have a lot to work with if they can rebrand. It's obviously a very, very big if.
That's a big if, yeah.
But Republicans enjoy their victory, sure. But man, this is, I mean, the long-term future of the Republican Party isn't as clear-cut after Trump as I think some people are interpreting it right now.
There's still a lot of question marks. I mean, here's another one. I mentioned this in my monologue. So in New York, they passed a constitutional amendment that they call it an Equal Rights Amendment. It includes protections for people based on their pregnancy status. So it's meant to protect people based on abortion, but they also added in their gender identity. And the opponents to this constitutional amendment ran ads saying, this is going to codify into the Constitution a right for transgender girls to play in girls' sports leagues. And it's going to codify a right for undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. They did the whole list of the conservative, the scariest things imaginable that can happen. I thought the trans piece was especially important. It was approved overwhelmingly. It was, not even close. So it was 2/3 to 1/3 effectively, even with that sort of messaging being run. And at the same time, New York is the state in the country that moved the most to Trump, 11.5 points that it shifted towards Trump. So, I just would it's easy to project on the population that, okay, well, they must have wanted Matt Gaetz as AG then if they voted for Trump, and they must have wanted Vivek to come in and slash $2 trillion from the budget, and Elon and get rid of, every social safety net program you can imagine, because that's what we were broadcasting we were going to do in advance. But I don't I don't think it's accurate to imagine. And if there had been a few different decisions made on the Democratic side, you can easily imagine them being able to win, and then the projection is, oh, this is this massive rejection of Trumpism, whatever. It's still very much a 50-50 country. So what I would say is, for the Democratic Party, the trends are death, right? If that Latino realignment continues to happen, if the working class realignment continues to happen, then they're in permanent minority status territory. But those trends are far from settled at this point.
Exactly.
And Donald Trump is truly this sort of uniquely charismatic political figure that could be like Obama, where Obama is able to put together this coalition that actually included a lot of white working class voters that other Democrats are just not ever able to put back together again. That's also a future possibility. So a couple of the things we wanted to share with you guys, so we could put B2 up on the screen. I want to take a note here. So this is the approval ratings for these various Trump nominees after people have been read some like negative things about them.
Oh, you're right. It's a progressive firm.
Right. It's a progressive firm. And this is like, okay, once we tell you a little bit about RFK Jr., how do you feel about him now? So, but all of these attacks against these people, like they are very salient in the media right now. And so it's not crazy to imagine that people are taking in some of the negative commentary about each of these individuals. And they've got all of them underwater. RFK Jr. -8, Lee Zeldin, who's been put up for EPA -15, Tulsi Gabbard -17, Hegseth -19, and no surprise, Gates coming in the worst here at -28. So, not exactly like a clear mandate for any of these appointments. And then this was interesting to me as well, Emily. So as we talked about on the show earlier this week, as I talked about with Sagar and with Shelby Talcott, Trump has affirmed his intention to use the military to help facilitate mass deportations, which, it's armed military officers in cities going door to door into workplaces or whatever. That's quite an image and not something that we've done before here, at least not in recent times in this country's history. And Rand Paul has come out and said that he's very much opposed to that. Let's take a listen to that.
I think what I would do if I were in charge of the immigration situation would be to first to go after those who have committed crimes. The big news right before the election was that there are 15,000 people in our country who have committed murder. There are about 13,000 that have committed sex crimes, violent sex crimes. That's 28,000 people. Why don't we start with that 28,000? Why don't we put out an all points bulletin and when we have them removed? I think if we start there, we'll be fine. I'm not in favor of sending the Army in uniforms into our cities to collect people. I think it's a terrible image, and that's not what we use our military for. We never have, and it's actually been illegal for over 100 years to bring the Army into our cities. Army and our military are trained to shoot the enemy. They're not trained to get a warrant to do what they're doing. The police have a difficult job, but the people removing people from our country need to be a police enforcement domestic agency, not the military. I'm all for remain in Mexico, I will not support an emergency to put the Army into our cities. I think that's a huge mistake.
What did you make of that from Rand Paul? I thought it was, at this point with Trump with such a lock in the Republican Party, for him to remain principled in this regard, I thought was really noteworthy.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And libertarians obviously tend to be more pro-immigration and even pro like just open borders in general, like explicitly open borders.
Right.
There should not be borders. And Rand Paul saying he wants to combine remain in Mexico with this opposition to having the military go rounding up undocumented immigrants is really interesting. And something that's very interesting about immigration in particular is pollsters use this stupid word thermostatic in terms of describing public opinion on immigration, which means we all remember during the Trump administration, one of the reasons Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was going to the border fence and weeping is that public opinion had shifted throughout the course of the Trump administration. Like people got steadily more pro-immigrant because they were opposed to at least the version of what Donald Trump was doing that the media was telling. There was funny business going on there that people in the press were reporting that what Donald Trump did had not happened under the Obama administration, or they were acting like it hadn't happened under the Obama administration. So you have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but Rand Paul just said it's a terrible image. Like he was talking about, in some ways, the public relations of having the military. I think he's opposed to it on the substance too, but the public relations of it is clearly going to be more dangerous than I think some people in hardcore Trump circles realize. That said, mass deportations actually poll well, which is surprising given how negative the media coverage of something like a mass deportation is. I think it speaks to some people's just like total disgust with what they're told is okay. It's like, yeah, mass deportations. You're asking me about that? Of course, like you're saying I shouldn't be in support of this. Like I'm in support of it because they've been told over and over again, this isn't a problem. You're not allowed to care about it. So I feel like that shows up in the polling when you actually see it done, if you're actually using the military to do it, instead of, we already have, by the way, militarized immigration forces. We have ICE, we have CBP, like these agencies exist. So, I mean, I think Rand Paul is offering a very useful dose of caution to the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because, I mean, we all remember those images from the first Trump administration of children who are crying and being, sort of mocked by Border Patrol agents. And it was truly horrifying. Like, I think people were really shocked and horrified by that. And to your point, the support for increasing immigration into the country reached like modern heights in opposition to that. But the other important thing you had then that was a distinction is that you had a Democratic Party that was unified against that view of immigrants and against the Trump immigration policy.
Yep.
And you
did well in the midterms.
That's right. And Biden won on a very pro-immigrant and oppositional to the Trump immigration policy. That was the message that he ran on. You guys will remember in the 2020 primary, them speaking their high school Spanish, whatever. And so you had this unified Democratic critique that you don't have anymore. And I've been saying the whole time that I thought it was a mistake, the way that the Biden-Harris people tried to handle this, of being like, you know what, we're going to do the hawkish border thing too.
Yeah.
We're going to dare Republicans to pass it. And then Kamala is going around talking about like how basically she's the one who's tougher on the border. No one is going to believe that, but you will help to foment more like rightward shift in terms of people's views on immigration. Because a lot of people who are partisans just like get their cues from the party.
Yeah.
And if you have both major parties, like basically immigrants are bad and they should all just be shipped down en masse and no, we shouldn't have a pathway to citizenship. Yeah, the public is going to shift to the right some. I do want to say though that even in that context, I just was looking at some polling. Immigration is one of those subjects in particular where it depends so much on how you ask the question, because people continue to have very complex views on the topic, where they continue to feel immigrants are, a net positive for the country and are a core part of like American identity. And, there continues to be significant support for things like a pathway to citizenship. So even on this issue where I'm not going to deny that there's been a rightward shift, I certainly think there has been a rightward shift, which has to do with the Democratic Party position and also does have to do with the fact that there has been an increase in immigrant crossings under the Biden administration. But even there, it's not as clear-cut as it is sometimes portrayed and depends a lot on how things are presented. And yeah, people may, when you just say, like, do you want to deport people, that's you don't actually have to see those human beings and what that looks like, or military in your city, in the workplace, whatever, and what that looks like. And that, can create a very different sense around the policy.
Totally, yeah. I mean, a lot of people who are very pro-immigration voted for Donald Trump because they're also very pro, quote-unquote, law and order. Like, people see those two things as not being mutually exclusive. That's why you're seeing him making gains, for example, with Hispanic voters, because people can hold two of those complicated views in their head at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Biden administration's policy was really the worst of all worlds, where they swung the pendulum way too far in one direction by their, like, sort of bureaucratic tweaking and asylum policy and all of that. But then on the other hand, tried to lie about it. You know what I mean? So like, instead of just saying we're doing this because people are fleeing gang violence or trafficking or whatever, instead of just owning it and saying that's exactly why these, policies that we put in place immediately after taking office, a lot of bureaucratic, administrative decisions that they made in the first 100 days, instead of owning it and saying what they were doing, they like lied about it, acted like it wasn't happening, and still claimed that they were being tough on the border and cracking down on the. It was like, what are you? It's the worst of both possible worlds, and I think that's part of why public opinion, where it was during the Trump years, it swung so far, is because Biden just had probably the worst possible policy.
Ryan also always points out that they also continued like the push, like the sanctions regimes that helped to push people. And, the incredible chaos in Haiti that we are always complicit in, the sanctions on Cuba, sanctions on Venezuela. Like, this is a major part of the migrant crisis as well. So let me just get to these next pieces, because this is important as well. We have an op-ed from Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in the Wall Street Journal, indicating some of their plans for what they want to do with this Department of Government Efficiency. Jeff Stein was tweeting about this. We can put this up on the screen. Some of the details. They say they think that SCOTUS could open the door to unilateral spending cuts, meaning that they wouldn't have to go through Congress based on what they say is the unconstitutionality of the 1974 budget law. He says that could be an absolutely massive pivotal fight. I think that is correct. And, the basic idea here is that they argue, yes, Congress has to authorize spending, but you're not then required to spend it. So if the executive wants to come in and basically say, like, we're going to slash all of these agencies and social safety net programs, like, we can unilaterally do that because we aren't obligated to actually spend the funds that Congress has authorized and appropriated. Let's put the next piece up on the screen also from Jeff summarizing this op-ed. So he says they gave us our first DOGE roadmap, as I understand the key steps. Number one, put DOGE people at each U.S. agency, then use advanced technology, potentially AI, to have them identify thousands of regulations to cut across government. Number two, give Trump a list of thousands of regulations to cut and have him approve their elimination. Number three, identify the minimum number of employees necessary to maintain each agency's core function, which should be lower once 2 is complete. For example, Musk oversaw about an 80% reduction in X headcount. Number 4, cut the federal employees. Number 5, cut programs where Congress's specific spending authorization has lapsed. That includes things like VA healthcare, NASA, and many anti-poverty programs. Number 6, approve a temporary suspension of payments amid large-scale audits. Don't really know what that means. Number 7, assert POTUS authority to stop spending without congressional approval by challenging that budget law we were talking about before. All seems to be without Congress, and then go and fight whatever you need to in the courts. And this is another thing where I think when people see this, a lot of people's natural instinct will be like, okay, that sounds great. Like government efficiency,
Agree.
like Musk is, personally, I think Musk, like the idea of having the richest man in the world, who is, by the way, I think largest Pentagon contractor, or one of the largest Pentagon contractors, in charge of just like, hey, do what you want. And by the way, has a bunch of legal issues with the federal government because of alleged labor violations and environmental violations and all kinds of other things. Now he gets to go in and be like, those regulations that I was running afoul of, no problem. Let me make sure I'm getting my taxpayer goodies are coming to me, but my competitors are maybe iced out. Like,
competitors.
And just the general thrust of, if you are a plutocrat, the weaker the government is, the better it is for you, because that's the only entity that can really check you and your impulses and the things that you want to do as the self-appointed master of the universe. That's my view. But I think a lot of people look at this and like, government efficiency sounds good.
Yep.
But again, like with the deportation, then when it's like, that means that Social Security is getting cut or payments aren't going out or VA healthcare stops or, various other important social safety net programs or school funding gets cut, whatever it is, when you actually get down to the specifics of what this looks like, it's another thing, because the budget is basically defense, which, Musk is going to continue to get his contract. And Trump has always increased the defense budget. I would be shocked if he did any different this administration. So it's defense. And then if you're not cutting defense, then everything else is basically like Social Security and Medicare. The other items in the budget are comparatively relatively trivial. So if you're making massive cuts, you are almost inherently cutting, those programs which are extremely popular and extremely important to the public.
Yeah, the political viability of doing this was experienced by the Republican Party when Donald Trump was first elected, and they had campaigned for nearly a decade on repeal and replace Obamacare, repeal and replace, repeal and replace. And then when the reality hit them, and senators, including John McCain, who said he would repeal and replace, ultimately voted down the legislation that had been, if there was a repeal and replace bill that could be as friendly to most of the party as possible, it's what they were ultimately voting on. And
right.
It lost by 1 vote. And it's because Republicans got really spooked by the reality of how voters would react when things changed. Would they be able to actually implement a change that was better than what they'd been saying they were going to repeal and replace? Does the replace part of that, you can repeal regulations, and I think obviously I support a lot of that, but how do voters react to it? It's pretty pretty serious question. That 1974 budget law in policy circles, that has just electrified the nerds. Like they're like, going crazy over what can actually, because it's really consequential.
Yeah.
The president can just, I mean, if they operate on that, and I'm sure it would be a lawsuit no matter what, but if they start operating on that principle, there's so much that they can do. And that's partially because there's so much administrative bloat. I mean, that is definitely part of it. But at the same time, the way that some of this happens, you know, they're going to have to make sure that there's an off-ramp. And that is what seems less certain that they want to do. That like for some of these programs that there'll actually be a way for people to adjust that isn't shocking and then translates into political losses.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.